The snow came down in sheets the night they brought him to Thornfield Hall, and Eliza Hartley was the only one awake to hear the bell. It rang once, then again, then a third time, sharp and desperate, and she set down the kettle she had been scrubbing and crossed herself before reaching for her shawl. Servants did not answer the gate at midnight in the dead of January. Not in the north. Not when the wolves had been heard 3 nights running along the ridge above the orchard. But Mrs. Penwarren was abed with a sore chest, and the steward had ridden into the village before the snow began, and the underfootman was useless after 10 o'clock, with the brandy he stole from the sideboard. So Eliza went. She lifted the lantern from its hook and pushed open the kitchen door, and the cold struck her like an open hand. The bell rang again as she crossed the yard. Whoever was pulling it the way a drowning man pulls at a rope. She fumbled the bolt with stiff fingers and dragged the gate inward against the drift, and the lantern light fell on something dark, crumpled in the snow. A man. Or what had been one. He was face down, with one arm flung out toward the bell pull, and the snow around him was not white. The snow around him was the color of wine, where it had soaked through whatever wound was killing him. His coat was a fine one, or it had been before someone had cut it open from collar to waist. His boots were good. His hands were not the hands of a beggar. And he was not moving. Eliza was 19 years old and the daughter of a country apothecary who had died before he could leave her anything but the knowledge in his books. She knelt in the snow and pressed 2 fingers to the cold hollow beneath the stranger's jaw, and she felt the faintest thread of a pulse, the way you feel a moth's wing through linen. "Sir," she said. "Sir, can you hear me?" He could not. She ran. She woke the under-footman with a slap that startled the brandy out of him, and she woke the boot boy and the kitchen lad, and the 4 of them dragged the stranger across the yard on a horse blanket, because he was too heavy to lift. They got him into the old steward's room off the kitchen, where the fire could be built up fast, and Eliza shut the door on the gawping boys and turned to the man bleeding to death on the steward's narrow bed. She did what her father had taught her. She cut his coat away with the kitchen shears. She found the wound, a deep stab below the ribs, ragged at the edges, the kind made by a blade pulled out at an angle by someone in a hurry. She found the second wound at his shoulder. She found the bruise across his temple, where someone had struck him hard enough to drop a horse. And she understood, kneeling over him in the lamplight, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hands red to the wrist, that this man had not been thrown from a carriage or set upon by footpads. This man had been left for dead by people who meant him to be dead. She closed the wounds with her father's curved needle and the silk thread Mrs. Penwarren kept in the linen press for mending tablecloths. She packed the punctures with honey and yarrow, because that was what her father had used in the village when he could not afford the surgeon's powders. She washed the blood from his face and from his hair, and when she had done all of that, she sat back on her heels and looked at him properly for the first time. He was, perhaps, 30. Black hair, cut shorter than the fashion. A jaw that had not been shaved in 3 days. A mouth that, even unconscious, looked as though it had not smiled in a long time. There was a scar through his left eyebrow, old and white, and another along his collarbone that she had uncovered while cutting away his shirt, and a third across the back of his right hand that looked as though something had once tried very hard to take the hand off. She did not know who he was. She would not have believed it if anyone had told her. By the time the household stirred at 6, The stranger was breathing in shallow flutters, and Eliza was still on the stool beside the bed, and the snow had stopped, and the sky beyond the kitchen window was the colour of wet slate. Mrs. Penwarren came down at 7:30, with her shawl pulled to her chin, and her face the grey of someone who had been up coughing half the night. She looked at a man on the bed, and at the basin of pink water, and at Eliza's bloodied apron. And she sat down heavily in the steward's chair and said, "Lord, have mercy." "He was at the gate," Eliza said. "Past midnight. The bell. Is he alive?" "For now." Mrs. Penwarren crossed herself the way Eliza had crossed herself an hour earlier in the snow, and she said, "We must send for the master. The master is in London until Easter. Then we must send for the magistrate." Eliza looked at the man on the bed. She looked at the cut of the coat she had ruined to save his life, and the signet ring that was still on the smallest finger of his left hand, because she had not been able to get it off over the swelling, and the scar across the back of his right hand. And she said, very quietly, "Mrs. Penwarren, look at his ring." Mrs. Penwarren looked. The blood went out of her face entirely. The ring on the stranger's hand was gold, and it was old, and it bore a wolf's head bracketed by 2 crossed swords, and there was no one in the north of England who did not know that crest. It was on the lintel of every coaching inn from York to the border. It was on the seal of every notice posted by the assizes for the past 6 years. It was on the gates of the great black house that stood 3 valleys to the east, the house that the village children would not walk past after dark, the house that belonged to the man the country folk called the Wolf of Ravensmere. Alaric Thorne, the Duke of Ravensmere, the man who had ridden into a French square at Salamanca and come out the other side alone, the man whose first wife had died in a manner the inquest had not satisfactorily explained, the man who tried 3 of his own tenants for poaching last autumn and hanged 2 of them. The most feared man north of the Trent was lying in their kitchen wing, half dead, in a bed meant for a steward. "Sweet Christ," Mrs. Penwarren said. "Yes," said Eliza. "We cannot send word." "No. If whoever did this learns he is alive, they will come and finish it." The 2 women looked at each other in the grey morning light, and a great many things passed between them that did not need to be said. Mrs. Penwarren had been at Thornfield since she was 14. She had buried 2 husbands and a son. She knew what kind of men did this kind of work, and she knew what they did when they came back to be sure of the job. "Then we tell no one," she said. "No one," said Eliza. "Not the boys, not the steward when he returns, not a soul in the village." "No." "And you," said Mrs. Penwarren, looking at her with something that was not unkindness, "will sit with him until he wakes or dies, and you will not leave that door." Eliza nodded, and that was how it began. For 11 days she sat with him. She fed him broth from a spoon when he could swallow, which was not often. She changed the dressings twice a day, morning and evening, and burned the soiled linen in the kitchen grate so the laundress would not see. She slept in the chair beside the bed, 2 hours at a time, with a shawl over her knees. She read aloud to him from her father's old book of country medicine, because Mrs. Penwarren said it was good for the dying to hear a human voice, and her own father had said the same once, the year the fever took half the village. On the 2nd day, he developed a fever that nearly killed him, and she sat with cold cloths on his forehead through a night so long she lost track of the hours. And at dawn, The fever broke, and his breathing steadied, and she put her face in her hands and wept for a full minute before she got up and made tea. On the fourth day, he opened his eyes for perhaps 3 seconds and looked at her without seeing her, and closed them again. And his mouth moved, but no sound came out. On the 6th day, she realized she had stopped being afraid of him. This was strange, because she should have been more afraid. She had had time, by the 6th day, to think about who he was and what he had done. She had had time to remember the stories. The poacher, Tom Hadley, who had hung at the crossroads through 3 weeks of August, before the magistrate let them cut him down. The first Duchess, who had fallen from a window. The tenant in the Eastern Valley, whose lease the Duke had revoked in the middle of winter for a debt of £9. She had had time to think about all of it. And yet, when she looked at the man in the bed, at the sunken cheekbones and the long, dark lashes, and the mouth that even in unconsciousness held its hard set, she did not feel afraid. She felt something else, and she did not have a name for it, and she did not try to find one. On the 8th day, she changed his bandages and noticed that the wound below his ribs had begun to close cleanly, and that the swelling around the puncture had gone down, and that his colour was no longer the colour of tallow, but the colour of a living man. And she said aloud to no one, "You are going to live." He did not answer, but his hand, lying open on the coverlet, twitched once, as if he had heard. On the 10th day, Mrs. Penwarren came in with a tray and looked at him for a long moment and said, "Child, you have not slept properly in a week and a half. Let me sit with him tonight." "No," said Eliza, "you will fall ill." "I will not." "Why?" Eliza could not answer her. She did not know why. She knew only that when she imagined leaving the room, even for a single night, something inside her chest pulled tight in a way she did not understand and could not explain to a woman who would have understood it perfectly well if either of them had been brave enough to name it. Mrs. Penwarren looked at her for another long moment, and her face did something complicated, and she set the tray down and went out without another word. On the 11th night, Eliza fell asleep in the chair with her father's book open on her lap, and she dreamed that the man in the bed was standing in the snow by the gate, and he turned to her, and his eyes were open, and he said her name. She woke with a start. It was nearly dawn. The fire had burned to embers. The book had slid from her lap to the floor, and the man in the bed was looking at her. Looking. Not staring blindly, not flickering between sleep and waking. Looking with the full weight of a conscious mind behind his eyes, in the grey light of a January dawn, and his eyes were the colour of wet slate, and they were fixed on her face, as though she were the only thing in the room. She could not move. For the space of perhaps 10 heartbeats they looked at each other, and the only sound in the room was the soft tick of the embers settling. And then his cracked lips parted, and he drew breath. "Eliza," he said. It was barely a sound. It was the shape of the word, made by a man whose throat had not formed words in 12 days. But it was her name, and it was unmistakable. And he had said it like a man saying a prayer he had been trying to remember for a long time. She could not speak. She could not stand. She could only sit with her hands flat on her knees and her heart beating somewhere in her ears, and stare at him. Because she had never told him her name. She had not said it once in 11 days. Mrs. Penwarren had called her child or girl. The boot boy had called her miss. She had never spoken her own name in this room, and she had never, in her life, met this man before the night she found him bleeding at the gate. "How?" she whispered. He closed his eyes. For a moment she thought he had gone again. Then his hand moved across the coverlet, slowly, as though it weighed a great deal, and his fingers found the edge of her sleeve where it lay against the bed. "Heard you," he said. "Reading. To me." His voice was a ruin. Each word cost him. 12 days, she said. "You should not. Please, you must not strain." "You said it," he whispered. "Once. To the housekeeper. The first night." She tried to remember. She could not. She had said 1,000 things in the first night. To Mrs. Penwarren, to the boys, to herself, to him, to God. Of course she had said her own name. Of course she had. And he had heard it, somewhere in the dark place where the dying go, before they decide whether to come back. And he had held on to it for 12 days, and he had brought it back with him. He brought it back like a man bringing back a coin from the bottom of a river. His fingers tightened, very slightly, on her sleeve. "Don't go," he said. And then he slept. Mrs. Penwarren found her there an hour later, still sitting in the chair, still with the Duke of Ravensmere's hand closed around her sleeve. And Mrs. Penwarren stood in the doorway with the breakfast tray and did not say a word. Eliza did not look up. "He spoke," she said. "He knew my name." Mrs. Penwarren set the tray down with great care. "Child," she said. "He had heard me say it, the first night. He held on to it for 12 days. Mrs. Penwarren sat down on the steward's stool. She looked at the Duke. She looked at Eliza. She looked at the long, thin fingers wrapped around the cuff of Eliza's grey work dress. And her face did the same complicated thing it had done 2 nights before. And this time, she said it. "You know who he is." "I know." "You know what he is." "I know what they say he is." "They say a great many things." "Yes. Some of them are true." Eliza looked down at the Duke's hand. The signet ring on the smallest finger had loosened with the loss of weight, and it had turned so that the wolf's head pressed into her sleeve like a brand. "He had been cut from collar to waist," she said. "Someone meant him to die in our snow." "Yes." "Why?" "Child," said Mrs. Penwarren, not unkindly. "Men like that are not killed without reason, and they are not killed without people." "Then those people are still out there." "Yes. And they think he is dead." "They had better." Eliza closed her hand, slowly, over the Duke's. His fingers were very cold. They had been cold for 12 days, and she had given up being startled by it. "Then we keep him alive," she said, "and we keep him hidden. And we wait." "For what?" "For him to be strong enough to tell us who did it." Mrs. Penwarren looked at her for a long time. Then she said, in a voice Eliza had never heard from her before, "Eliza, listen to me very carefully. Whatever you are beginning to feel, stop it now. Stop it before it has roots. He is not for you. He cannot be for you. Men of his rank do not marry maids who pulled them from the snow. They thank them. They reward them. Sometimes, if they are decent men, they remember them. but they do not marry them. And if you let yourself love him, you will spend the rest of your life knowing what it was to be loved back for one winter and discarded in the spring. Do you understand me?" Eliza did not look up from the Duke's hand. "I understand you," she said. "Then stop." "I cannot." "Eliza, I cannot, Mrs. Penwarren, because it is already done." The older woman closed her eyes. She crossed herself for the third time in 12 days, and she sat with Eliza in the grey light, and after a while she got up and made tea. He grew stronger by inches. On the 13th day he could lift his head. On the 15th he could sit propped against the pillows for the space of an hour. On the 17th he asked for paper and ink, and Eliza brought it to him, and he wrote 3 lines in a hand that wavered like a child's. And he sealed the letter with his own ring, and he gave it to her and said, "Burn this in the kitchen grate. Do not let anyone see the seal." She burned it. On the 18th day he asked her to tell him exactly what he had looked like when she found him, and she told him, and he listened with his face turned away to the window. And when she had finished, he said, very quietly, "2 men. There were 2 of them. One of them is my cousin." She did not know what to say. "He is my heir," said the Duke, still looking at the window. "If I die without sons, do you understand?" "Yes." "He has tried before." "How?" "A horse that should not have been spooked, a staircase that should not have been waxed, a cup of wine that should have been mine and was a footman's instead. The footman lived, barely." He paused. "His name is Cassian Thorn. Remember it. If anything happens to me, you tell the magistrate at Hexham. Not the local man. The local man is bought. You tell the magistrate at Hexham that Cassian Thorn came up the North Road on the night of the 15th of January, and that I survived the ditch he left me in. Will you remember that?" "I will remember." Eliza. It was the second time he had said her name. It still landed in her chest like a bell being struck. "Yes. Thank you." She did not trust herself to speak. On the 21st day, the world found them. She was in the still room, drying lavender, when she heard the hooves in the yard. 3 horses, ridden hard. Men's voices. A door slamming. Mrs. Penwarren shouting for the boot boy. Eliza dropped the lavender and ran. She came through the kitchen passage in time to see 2 strangers in dark riding coats standing in the steward's hall. One of them tall and pale and beautifully dressed, the other shorter and broader, and with his hand resting on the hilt of a riding sword. The tall, pale one was smiling. He was smiling at Mrs. Penwarren as though they were old friends, and Mrs. Penwarren's face was the colour of paper. "Madam," the tall one was saying, in a voice as smooth as poured cream, "I do apologize for the early hour, but you understand. A missing kinsman, a frantic family. We have been calling at every estate from York to the border. You will forgive us our thoroughness." Eliza stopped in the passage. She knew, with a certainty that struck her like cold water, that this was Cassian Thorn. He did not look like a murderer. He looked like a man who had been told, in his cradle, that he was beautiful, and that the world owed him things. He had Alaric's colouring, and Alaric's height, and none of Alaric's weight behind the eyes. He looked, Eliza thought, like a portrait of the Duke painted by someone who had never met him. "We have had no callers, sir," Mrs. Penwarren was saying. "The master is in London. The house is shut up but for the kitchen wing. There has been no— And yet, said Cassian Thorne pleasantly, a man at the Black Bull in Rookhope tells me a maid from this house was buying yarrow and feverfew at the village shop on the 7th of January. Yarrow and feverfew. In quantities, he said, that a girl might use to dress a wound. A bad one. The room went very still. Mrs. Penwarren did not move. The boot boy behind her made a small sound and went silent. And Eliza, standing in the passage with her hands going cold, understood what was happening with terrible clarity. He had not been calling at every estate. He had been calling at the ones where strange purchases had been made. He had been hunting his cousin's body backward, through the apothecaries of the north, and he had found it. Cassian Thorne turned his head, slowly, and looked directly at her. "Ah," he said, and he smiled. "And here, I think, is the maid in question." She did not move. "Come here, child." She did not move. "Come here," he said again, and the smoothness was beginning to slip, and beneath it was the thing she had felt the first time she had touched the wound in the Duke's side, the thing that had been done by a hand in a hurry, the thing that meant to kill. "Come here, or I will have my man fetch you." The man with the sword took a half-step forward, and then a voice came down the passage behind her. A voice that was still hoarse, still ruined at the edges, but a voice that had spoken her name like a prayer 11 days ago. And it said now, very clearly, "She will not be coming to you, Cassian. She will be standing exactly where she is." Eliza turned. The Duke of Ravensmere was at the foot of the steward's stair, leaning on the wall with one hand pressed flat against his side, and the other resting on the stock of a long pistol he had taken from God knew where. And his face was the colour of bone, and his eyes were the colour of wet slate, and they were fixed on his cousin with an expression Eliza had not seen on any human face before. "Hello, Cassian," he said. "I appear to have lived." What happened next happened very fast. The man with the sword reached for it, and the Duke shot him in the shoulder before his hand had closed on the hilt, and the man went down with a sound like a sack of grain falling off a cart. The pistol smoke filled the steward's hall. Mrs. Penwarren screamed and did not move. The boot boy ran. Cassian Thorne stood absolutely still with his hands open and his beautiful pale face draining to something grey. "Alaric," he said, "be quiet." "Alaric, cousin, there has been a misunderstanding." "There has been," said the Duke. "No misunderstanding at all." He took a step away from the wall. Eliza saw what it cost him. She saw the way his weight came down through the hand on the pistol, and the way the pistol shook. And she crossed the passage without thinking and got her shoulder under his arm and took half his weight against her side. And he did not look at her, but his free hand closed for a moment around her wrist and squeezed once, and let go. "Eliza," he said, still looking at his cousin. "There is a writing desk in the study, the top drawer. There is a sealed letter inside it, addressed to the magistrate at Hexham. Bring it to me." "Now?" "Now." She went. She came back at a run with the letter in her hand, and the Duke was still standing with the pistol levelled at his cousin's chest, and the wounded man was still bleeding on the flagstones, and Mrs. Penwarren had sat down on the bottom step of the stair with her hands over her mouth. The Duke took the letter. He held it up. "This," he said, "was written on the 18th of January, in the hand of the maid who pulled me from your snow, dictated by me and signed by me, and sealed with this ring. It names you. It names your man. It names the inn on the North Road where you waited 4 hours for word that I was dead. It is one of 3 identical letters. The other 2 are with people you will not find. If I die, tonight, next month, or in 40 years of an apparent natural cause, those letters reach the magistrate at Hexham, the Lord Lieutenant of Northumberland, and a particular friend of mine in Whitehall, whose name you would recognize if I cared to share it. Do you understand me, Cassian? Cassian Thorne did not answer. Do you understand me? Yes. You will leave this house. You will leave for North. You will sail, before the 1st of March, for whatever colony will have you. And you will never return to England in my lifetime, or after it. If you do, those letters will be opened, and you will hang. Do you understand? Yes. Take your man, take your horse. Get out of my sight. Cassian Thorne stood for another second, looking at his cousin. And then his beautiful face did something Eliza would remember for the rest of her life. It crumpled. Not with grief, with the recognition, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he had lost something he could not get back. He bent and got his arm under the wounded swordsman, and he half dragged him out of the steward's hall. And the door slammed, and after a long moment, they heard the hooves go down the drive at a gallop. The Duke stood for one more breath. Then his knees went, and Eliza caught him before he hit the floor, and the pistol fell from his hand and skittered across the flagstones. Eliza, he said against her shoulder, I have you. I am sorry. Hush. I am sorry you saw that. I am not. She got him to the chair Mrs. Penwarren had vacated. She put her hand against his forehead and felt the heat coming off him. The wound below his ribs had opened in the strain of the last 10 minutes. She could feel the wet through his shirt against her sleeve. She looked at Mrs. Penwarren, who was beginning to stand, very shakily, from her place on the stair. Help me, Eliza said. He bled badly that afternoon, and worse that night, and for 2 days she was not certain again whether he would live. But she had done it once, and she did it again. She stitched what had torn. She packed the wound with honey and yarrow. She sat with him through the second fever, which was not as bad as the first, and on the 3rd morning he woke and looked at her and said, Still here. Still here. Why? Because you asked me not to go. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was something in them she had not seen before. Not in the grey light of the dawn he had said her name in. Not in the steward's hall when he had aimed a pistol at a man who shared his blood. Not in any of the 11 days she had sat beside him in silence. It was fear. Eliza, he said. Yes. I have something to ask you, and I am asking it badly, because I have not asked anyone anything in a very long time, and I do not know how. So I will ask it the way I would ask it if I were the man I was at 20, before any of this, before Salamanca and before the first marriage, and before Cassian put a knife in me. Will you let me ask it badly? Yes. I am 34 years old. I am the Duke of Ravensmere. I have 11,000 acres and a house I cannot stand to live in, and a name that frightens children in 3 counties. I have killed men in war, and I have hanged men under the law, and I have done one of those things rightly, and I am not certain about the other. I have been married once, to a woman who fell from a window because she could not bear to live in the same house as me. I have not slept a full night since I was 26. I have not been touched by anyone who was not paid to touch me in 8 years. Until you. She could not speak. "I heard your voice," he said, "before I knew I was alive. I heard you read to me from a country apothecary's book, and I heard you say my name to the housekeeper in a voice that had no fear in it. And I heard you say your own name once, on the first night, when you thought I could not hear. And I held on to it. I held on to it the way a man in a cold river holds onto a rope. I do not know how to tell you what it was to come back into my body and find you in the chair beside it. I do not know how to tell you what it was to look at you and know your name before I knew my own." He stopped. He drew breath. His hand on the coverlet was shaking. "I will not ask you to marry me today," he said. "I will not ask you tomorrow. I will not ask you until I am out of this bed and on my feet and back in my own house and sane again, because I will not have it said that I asked you when I was half out of my mind with fever and gratitude. But I am telling you now, in this room, while I have the courage of a sick man, that I am going to ask you. And I am telling you so that you have time. Time to decide whether you can bear it. The house and the name and the talk and the cousins and the woman who fell from the window and me. I am telling you so that when I ask you, in the spring, in my own clothes, on my own feet, in a room where I do not look like a man who needs a nurse, you will already know. And you will say yes, or you will say no, and I will accept whichever it is. But I am telling you now, Eliza, because I have been silent for 12 days while you sat with me, and I will not be silent any more." She put her hand over his. "Elaric," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. He flinched, as though she had touched a wound. "I will not make you wait until spring. I will not make you wait, because I made my decision on the 6th day, when I stopped being afraid of you. And I have not changed it since. And I will not change it in 3 months, in a different room, with you in different clothes. So ask me badly. Ask me now, while we are both in the only room where any of this has been true." He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, in a voice that was barely a voice, "Eliza Hartley, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "I will." They were married in April, in the little chapel at Ravensmere, with Mrs. Penwarren in the front pew and the Duke's particular friend in Whitehall standing as witness. The talk in the village was extraordinary for about a fortnight, and then, as such talk does, it became the ordinary kind of talk. The kind that shrugs and says, "Well, there it is," and gets on with the harvest. Cassian Thorne sailed for the Cape on the 28th of February. The Duchess of Ravensmere, who had once been a maid in a kitchen wing at Thornfield Hall, kept her father's old book of country medicine on a shelf in the morning room, and used it, more often than the new doctor liked, when the tenant's children took fevers. And on the first night of the first snow of the following January, exactly 1 year after she had crossed a yard with a lantern in her hand and found a dying man at the gate, the Duke of Ravensmere woke at 3 in the morning, as he sometimes still did, to the old dream of being cold and bleeding and alone in a country he did not know. He turned his head on the pillow. His wife was beside him, asleep, with one hand open on the coverlet between them. He closed his hand over hers. She did not wake, but her fingers tightened, very slightly, as though even sleeping, she had heard. And the Duke of Ravensmere, who had not slept a full night since he was 26, closed his eyes in the dark of his own house and slept until morning.